you. I'm going to, during the first part, well, this is going to be done in two parts. So it's kind of like one mini lecture, and then I'll go out there, and then we'll see where we are, whether we take the break there or whether I do the next bit, and then we take the break and then come back and have a dialogue again. I've been trying this. A colleague in Inverness actually suggested this, and I tried it actually in Edinburgh, and I think it worked really well because it gave me a little rest, but it also allowed folks to kind of not have to wait till the end, you know, to ask their questions and that kind of thing. So it worked well. So are we good, Stuart? Okay, great. So let me begin by saying thank you, especially thank you to Gordon Asher, who really is the person, the force behind all of these talks and making this happen. Incredible solidarity as a comrade, colleague, friend. And I'm so appreciative. I'm so appreciative to the folks here, to Louise and Helene for the incredible hospitality and just making these things. And I want to, Keith Smythe is here from Inverness, and he was incredible in terms of just making some wonderful things happen there and making my stay really lovely. And Alex, I always mispronounce his name. I'm sorry, Alex, but Alex, also thank you for your contribution to making this a really beautiful, beautiful time for me here in Scotland. It's the first time that I've been in Scotland, and I will definitely go away feeling that I've made some friends and really connected from the heart with other people whose political struggles and their commitment to this work is absolutely central to their lives. So let me begin. Over the last decades, neoliberal policies and practices have deeply transformed the landscape of education in the United States and abroad. This has resulted in staggering changes to state and national educational policy debates about the curriculum, assessment and accountability, teacher preparation, educational leadership, and conditions under which research is carried out. Simultaneously, material conditions have become increasingly grim within subaltern communities where economic restructuring, post-industrial conditions of urban life, widespread gentrification, the globalization of the economy, and ecological destruction has appallingly become the norm. A reality that is often obscured by an increasing affluent population, including increasing affluent student population in terms of numbers, not percentage, in terms of numbers. But this increasing affluent student population then within universities has become fodder for the globalization of education as another site of profit and a burgeoning neo-colonial project of knowledge control. And we see this in particular, for example, when students, one example that I've given before is that students in India, I was recently in India, and so many of the students felt that being educated in India in somehow meant they were going to have a lesser education than if they went to the States, to the US, or they came to Great Britain. And that was their take on it. And they said, when I asked them, you know, how did they come to think that way? They said, well, that's what they heard their professor saying. Oh, we've got to find a way to get you out of here so that you can go out. So it seems to me that that often it's a good example of how the colonial mentality persists even beyond the actual, you know, structure of colonialism has supposedly left the field. Inherent global inequalities then must be understood as part of a deep structural and epistemic political economic project that overwhelmingly shapes power relations, both domestically and internationally. And despite advances made over the last 2 decades, humanity still remains deeply divided between the haves and have-nots. Yet despite the severity of global inequalities, the tendency to overlook poverty as fundamentally unnecessary prerequisite of capitalism in discussions of exclusion in education and beyond is absolutely pervasive. In the process, the construction and imposition of deceptive myths and deficit views of the subaltern abound. myths that function to preserve and deepen institutional structures of what Paulo Freire called cultural invasion, associated with Eurocentric forms of social and material control over subaltern populations. Hence, anti-imperialist challenges to Eurocentrism signal shameless domination and sweeping control over the internationalization of capital and a narrow culture of knowledge production that results in a concentration of power, wealth, and resources among a small percentage of the world's population, along with a deepening apparatus of social control. So although there's much talk then internationally about social justice and education, I mean, it seems every other conference has, I can tell you how many workshops and seminars about social justice, or they're opening up a social justice program, et cetera, right? So despite all these conversations, the question of social justice is generally discussed by way of abstracted and conservative notions that are incapable of leading us towards a decolonizing future, where a culturally democratic understanding of justice within education and society can flourish. One of the reasons for this is the mainstream constructs speak of equality and social justice as if we were all playing on a level field, and it is just a matter of tweaking the system or the individual a bit here and there. Nothing could be farther from the truth, in that what we are contending with are long-standing inequalities that not only persist, but in some instances are widening. For example, the wealthiest country in the world, the US, right? Poverty is still taking a devastating toll on millions of people. Today, there are 95 million poor or low-income Americans. According to a recent Scottish government briefing to bring it to home, 16% of adults and 19%, or 1 out of every 4 child in Scotland lives in poverty before housing costs. So imagine after housing costs, that actually goes up. Income inequality is increasing, and the toxic combination of tax breaks for the rich, growing unemployment, increasing indebtedness, and devastating cuts to the social safety net in the US and other nations belie the well-intentioned rhetoric of global education. In light of an unrelenting consumer-driven international economic agenda, those committed to social justice then must grapple seriously with the role and purpose of higher education in perpetuating inequalities. And often what you hear is this social mobility. In the States anyway, I should tell you, around the question of education, there's this rhetoric around social mobility. There's just been Pickardry, just a sociologist, or he may be an economist, who just came out with a whole, research that he's done that actually shows that the whole social mobility notion is actually bogus. And in the United States, interestingly enough, actually has far lower social mobility than some of its neighbors, including Canada. So in light of also an unrelenting consumer-driven international economic agenda, those committed to social justice must then grapple with how higher education is perpetuating those inequalities. And in the face of these contemporary hegemonic forces, every aspect of our life is being colonized and commodified from birth to death, leaving many simply dissatisfied, estranged, and disempowered. And often when I speak about this, I mention the example or an experience that I had when my stepfather died. He died in the hospital, and it was all this noise and all this stuff going on. It is this institutional context. My mother died 3 months later, but she died at home. So I kept her at home. We didn't take her to the hospital, even though we knew that she was dying. And I can tell you that the experience for us of my mother dying at home was far more humane, far greater dignity than my stepdad who died in the hospital. And I've seen the similar elements in terms of childbirth, where children that are being born at home, in terms of home births, a very different relationship than the institutionalized childbirth. And so the reason I bring this up is that we need to rethink some of the ways in which our lives have been institutionalized that are actually not to our interests. And in many ways, they actually disrupt the deep intimacy of our humanity. just to say a few things about this notion of decolonizing social justice. In direct contradiction, decolonizing views of social justice must challenge the racializing culture of class caste formation that systematically works to erode subaltern belonging, identity, voice, and participation, stripping away our histories, cultural knowledges, ancestral wisdoms, and our languages. In the process, subaltern populations deemed as other continue to be reduced to objects or things to be manipulated, to be used as a reserved army, for example, in the United States, or to defend essentially the economic and military agendas of the wealthy and the powerful, because that's what war is, after all. I mean, they create this notion that is some nationalist project. It's a nationalist project, but it really is tied to defending the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. As such, traditional educational research and leadership approaches springing out of this one-dimensionality of advanced capitalism and an epistemology of domination continues to produce what the Martinique poet, author, and founding father of negritude, Aimé Césaire, considered the thingification of oppressed populations. Césaire, as did Frantz Fanon, spoke to the continuing destruction of colonized populations in so-called underdeveloped countries or nations, pointing to the millions of men and women torn from their gods, their lands, and their habits, their life, from the dance, from wisdom. The racism that undergirds this phenomena is precisely what has led, for example, to the underrepresentation, the unprecedented incarceration rate within the United States, which imprisons 25% of the world's inmates. And a disproportionate number of black and brown population now live behind bars in the United States. But I also want to share with you, again, to bring it home, is that this is not just happening in the United States. In Scotland, a similar phenomena of increasing incarceration, and if you look, this of course is Scotland's incarceration, is there this, you know, it's become a norm to incarcerate poor people, to incarcerate anyone who has been problematic to capitalist accumulation. And this cannot be explained, this incarceration rate, this increasing incarceration rate can't be explained by crime levels. Crime levels have actually gone down. They've gone down, and incarceration has gone up. In terms of some of the statistics that some of you may know in terms of incarceration, here in Scotland, 95% are men, but there is a growing increase of female incarceration. Something like in the last decade, a 700% increase in terms of female incarceration. That 72% of the people who are incarcerated are under 36 years old. So they're young. It's a young population that's incarcerated. That approximately 25%, in other words, 1 in 4 is illiterate. So they come from working class, from impoverished, from miseducation. All of these elements are at work, and 62% have some drug-related offense. So it's not homicide. It's not, you know, it is in fact related to drugs. And what often we don't think about, because of the kind of moralism around how people look at this question of drug addiction or alcohol addiction, is the fact that that often folks who are suffering find ways and means by which to help the suffering be reduced, to numb the suffering in their own bodies. And there's, you know, some humanizing ways that we have to be willing to engage with issues of addiction, especially when we have to ask the question, where are the drugs coming from? Who is benefiting in relationship to the selling of those drugs, right? Anyway, there's a whole lot that could be said about that. I want to turn now to the notion of coloniality, the coloniality of power. What cannot be denied then is that institutions, including education, are driven by the larger political structures of class inequality in which they are embedded, forcing us to acknowledge that mainstream pedagogies, methodologies, and leadership approaches are deeply implicated here. Hence, it should not be surprising that practices within educational institutions around the world still perpetuate what Walter Mignolo and others refer to as the coloniality of power, which acts in direct opposition to the intentionality of decolonizing approaches. And if, is it, okay, let's keep, up right there. Okay, thank you, Louise. I know it's kind of, but I really appreciate you doing that for me. So this, what we're engaging here is how a coloniality of power acts in direct opposition to the intentionality of decolonizing approaches. In fact, over the centuries, the forces of conquest, genocide, removal, colonization, imperialism, detribalization, urbanization, and relocation have deeply altered subaltern communities worldwide. One of the worst consequences of such a practice or such practices has been the despicable creation of economic dependency among politically and economically oppressed populations through what Frantz Fanon called a perverted logic. As such, challenging the historical and contemporary impact of a colonizing dependency must be at the heart of a decolonizing epistemology that seeks to delink our understanding of culturally subordinated populations from Western epistemicid's being the death of knowledge, which Paraschiva and de Sousa Santos speak about. And here we need to think about reasserting then the history into our understanding of education, affirming the histories, knowledges, and wisdoms that have been negated by European modernity. Key to this analysis is the infusion of decolonizing perspectives that recognizes the inseparability of coloniality and the capitalist imperative of European modernity and its continuing impact on the world's most oppressed populations. It embodies a conceptual reading of history that profoundly critiques and challenges the official scripts of colonization and their accompanied post-colonial celebrations, insisting that the colonial matrix of power imposed upon the subaltern persists long after the withdrawal of colonial political forces of domination. In many ways, this discourse of neoliberalism in the guise of globalization has functioned as a deeply cunning diversion of the wealthy and powerful to derail anti-imperialist challenges to their unjust privileges and deeply embedded epistemology of separation and of conquest. Conceptualizing decolonizing praxis from this critical vantage point sheds light on the whitewash, partiality, and limitations of recorded accounts of official knowledge, revealing the absence of subaltern worldviews suppressed by the epistemicides that sustain what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls an abyssal divide, where the other is rendered irrelevant or non-existent. Of this, Santos writes, what most fundamentally characterizes the abyssal thinking is thus the impossibility of the co-presence of the two sides of the line. To the extent that it prevails, this side of the line only prevails by exhausting the field of relevant reality on this side. Beyond it, there is non-existence, invisibility, non-dialectical absence. This speaks, it's important that we recognize that part of what he's trying to say is the manner in which colonialism actually narrows rationality. It narrows what is considered to be legitimate knowledge. And it uses that narrowing as a means to impose its own imperial imperatives, and in so many ways then to exclude. It is part of the process of exclusion, and it's an epistemological function. And why we need to understand this as educators is the recognition that all of us, if we've been educated within a traditional university, we have been educated by way of an epistemology of conquest, whether we realized it or not. Moreover, what has been ignored is the manner in which class caste formations and implicit beliefs, attitudes, and values are tied to the colonial matrix of power and a global coloniality of power. So it isn't just regional, it's global, a global phenomena that's interpolated through institutionalized class caste expectations defined by the ruling interests of the economically and politically powerful, and carried out, as Gramsci reminds us, by the country's most inconspicuous moral leaders, namely educators at all levels. Yet for those who have been systematically betrayed by colonizing forms of education, Paulo Freire sought to support educational projects grounded in a critical vision of social justice, which resonated with anti-colonial struggles for self-determination and democratic control of our own destinies. As such, Freire's pedagogical values are anchored in a social and material praxis of transformation. Transformation of ideas, of attitudes, of structures and practices within education and society that conserve what he termed the oppressor contradiction, a phenomenon in which ontologically and epistemologically we persist bound to the colonial matrix of power that encompasses economic control, control of authority, control of the public sphere, and ideological control of all that is considered to be truth. So I want to stop there. Okay, so that kind of sets the context, and I thought I could stop there. The next piece is on Freirean values for decolonizing praxis. So setting kind of the context in which I'm thinking about this question in terms of Freire's values. Then what I might do is just stop and see if there might be some questions or thoughts that you all that are coming up for you as I've presented that first bit. And it can just be a comment. It can be in relationship to your own experience, your own practice, or a question that may have arisen. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you very much for that. Could you? I scribbled down the phrase "decolonizing social justice," and then I was scribbling and I kind of lost my. Could you go back and just re-explain that? Are you talking about the need to decolonize that actual phrase and how it's understood and how it's enacted?
To understand that any praxis that considers itself to be a praxis, a social justice praxis, must engage with the question of colonization and the historical legacy of colonization, particularly with respect to subaltern populations or populations who were colonized in history.
And that's an important thing, especially with the way that the phrase might be being reused or
exactly
used without
right.
that thought.
And part of the issue is that often people are they'll talk about decolonizing and not even engage the issues of the economy. They will not engage the manner in which we need to think very structurally in terms of how the structure is completely dependent on the political economy. There is not a separation between organizational structural, societal structure and the political economy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like you to, so you're talking about these complex issues, which in very analytical ways. Can you talk a bit about how you feel when you're practicing and what drives you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because, of course, another piece of the work that I do, I'm not presenting on it, but is really around the question of embodiment and the manner in which, in many ways, oppression teaches us to disembody ourselves, to separate head from body, in many respects. But in terms of the work we're doing, that's exactly what we need not to do. So it means then having to learn to open ourselves up to engage with our own interior and understanding the relationship between our interior world and the exterior world and the intersubjectivity that exists, that is always at work in relationship to our lives. So in this context, for example, I'll give you an example that just happened yesterday. Okay, so yesterday we had a meeting, and some of you were at this meeting, and so that you're going to get another side of the meeting, which is what was going on in my head or what was going on in my body. Part of what I noticed going on in my body was there was a part of me that felt this like a tension coming up. And I kept thinking, like, why is this tension, coming up? And I'm thinking about, what's happening in my body. What I know now is that I don't do what psychologists want us to do. They want us to go in and think that it's just some individual problem in ourselves, because I understand myself as very communal and part of everything that's going on and connected and interdependent with others. I think what was going on for us, how was I responding in terms of what was going on for us? And in that case, I was feeling a certain sense of tension in my body. And the tension had a lot to do with my own struggle my own struggle with the sadness that I feel still deep in my body on some embeddedness over a history of oppression. I mean, even when I begin to speak of it, it causes a certain reaction in my body. When I was going through the process of my intellectual formation, I was told by very well-meaning professors that I needed to be careful about not being too emotional, and that I might be seen as verging on the hysterical, or that people would think that I was trying to manipulate them with my emotions. This kind of. I want to curse because that's just what I thought. Right. Because sometimes it's just a shortcut way, but it really has to do with the fact that we're responding. I mean, I can be speaking about these issues in terms of how they manifest themselves as a phenomenon, right? And there's a certain abstract dimension. But what I'm saying is that it's never abstract, that we're feeling and experiencing it, that oppression lives in our bodies, that working class people, you can see, people who live in poverty, you can see it, in terms of, in our mouth, you can see it in our body, you can see it in how we respond. And it was really interesting because I was thinking about last night, and I was thinking how resistant sometimes we are because people who have been colonized, and we were talking about this, right, Alex, how those who have a legacy of colonization, we're always concerned about being duped. Is that a word that you use here? Yeah. Duped, that we're always concerned that somehow, maybe somebody's trying to, because in fact, historically, we have had a lot of stuff, pulled over us, our wool pulled over our heads or whatever, this kind of. And so what happens is our bodies respond by wanting to shut down until we feel like we have enough information. And it happens without even us being aware. It becomes a habitual way of responding as soon as there's a particular discourse going on. And so I've been thinking a lot of what that means when we're working within a context where people have been colonized. And I have to tell you, I mean, one of the most beautiful things about being here in Scotland is that I knew more about the colonization in Ireland. I did not know as much about the colonization in Scotland. I knew in Ireland, but not in Scotland. I mean, I knew there had been, but I never knew it to this extent. And so I find it an interesting phenomenon in terms of the discourse and whether people ever think that their colonial history in Scotland can continue to have an impact today in relationship to the politics and how they see the world and how they, because I know it certainly has for us, for those of us that were colonized, and for those of us that continue to be colonized like myself, as Puerto Riqueña, in the Caribbean. I'm from Puerto Rico. Yeah.
It's interesting you say, because there's something actually happening in Scotland just now about that.
Yeah.
Because Glasgow specifically, because it was money was made, so much money made within the Glasgow by the merchants. Yeah. And so they gave and part of also what happened is they were all dying. They suddenly had some, I don't know what other people think about this, but from my understanding, they kind of somehow had some sort of conscience, and they suddenly gifted so much of it to the people. It's like suddenly they had this realization, and there's even artwork that there has actually been like servants and slaves painted over, because it became unfashionable to show that part of actually the history. And so you had actually bits of the pictures hidden by the way of changing mindsets. Oh no, that's not acceptable anymore, so we'll just cover that up and we'll keep it in public display because we, you know, and so there's so much, and so there's also a thing happened, it's happened within the Glasgow University. There's that they're exchanging with other like universities in the Caribbean and looking at where we can bring value.
Yes.
Where we can't give the price back of human life, you can't give the price back of spices and all these other things that were stolen. Or because we have to remember also there were both sides of it as well. Like there were Caribbean people that were profiteering as well as you know. So this is the kind of thing. So they wanted to address this as well. They want to see this kind of how we can actually exchange in a mutual way, and it doesn't have to be about well, I've not got enough and you've got too much. It can actually start that natural process. So there's something happening around about that. It's wonderful because it's obviously in the air. You know, this energy is what you're talking.
Isn't that colonial though? I mean, in what way is it a mutual exchange if our universities tell us to go to other countries and transfer our expert knowledge to them?
That's one way of looking at it, yeah, but what they're suggesting is that that's part of that, but it's about countries that have had the resource taken from them, then looking at what would seem valuable for them.
Well, in my understanding of all the university initiatives around international exchange and the Global Challenges Research Fund, is it's very much driven by a north till south.
Right.
And that's no one. I don't believe I'm talking about that.
But I'm talking even like all of the other initiatives. I think there is a real colonial dynamic.
I agree
to that.
completely. There's a whole
All right. So this is let's stop for just for a second, okay? Because this what we're just witnessing and experiencing right now is exactly the kinds of conversations that have to happen. They have to happen. We need to be able to unpack so that we might be able to see the multidimensionality that might create alternative possibilities in our understanding about those relationships, right? So it doesn't mean that one particular perspective is left out, but we do have to realize that the historical relationship has been a colonial relationship, particularly in terms of the university, and that universities today continue to have that. And I'll give you an example in the United States, the notion of service learning. I don't know, are you all, okay, so the notion of service learning. You know, it is always presented like this kind of very altruistic, and, you know, students are going to go and they're going to learn about, you know, another country and blah, 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 and all of this stuff, right? And so they do that, and then when they're finished, they leave, and, you know, they're done. And they've got to put it on the resume. So I have one of my doctoral students from a couple of years ago wrote this wonderful dissertation that is now a book, essentially, that asks the question, service learning for whom? You know, and does an epistemological and political economic argument that in fact this is just part of the colonial tradition that is moved forth in terms of the knowledge that is considered legitimate and then gets perpetuated. However, the other piece of this is that if we are in fact are going to move towards a politics of decolonizing and a politics of liberation, it's going to require all our participation. And it's going to require the kinds of hard, difficult conversations that we've got to stop bifurcating and begin to see what is the relationship between them and what can we learn from these different positions. Because it is a different relationship if a community comes together and says, this is part of what we need. So if you say you want to be of assistance to our community, this is what we need. Don't tell us what we need. It is our responsibility to make those decisions. We are capable of making those decisions. It may take us longer because we haven't had as many opportunities, but we will come up with decisions, and in that process is a process of empowerment. So it's a very different way in which the process is situated. So I want us to we're going to have to struggle around our own tendency, and this comes out of our very tradition of critique, our tradition of critique within the academy, you know, and I'm talking about the left, is one of debate. So what ends up happening is that we are always having debates, which is not a dialogue. and I'm sorry, Keith, you probably heard me say this a number of times, but we've got to come to terms that part of what we're struggling with is an epistemology of conquest. So even the way that we have arguments is about, I'm going to show you how you're wrong, and I'm going to show you how I'm right, and there's only one way to be right, and it is always about losers and winners, and it is a war, not a dialogue. And part of our struggle is that we have to see how we've internalized, how we've been, not only, it hasn't just been internalized, we have been socialized and conditioned into an epistemology of conquest, even in our daily lives, and often in our relationships, even in our personal relationships.
On that, in terms of coloniality in Scotland, there seems a real need to appreciate that deep contradiction that we're sitting in between the extent to which coloniality has happened in and to Scotland and the extent to which Scots are both the foot soldiers and beneficiaries of empire and colonialism, and not just
That's
historically but in the present.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, what you've just said, Gordon, for me is an example of what I mean about engaging with the multidimensionality of the problem and of the issues. That it isn't just one-sided here, but that in fact we've got to look at who has benefited from particular relations of power, you know, and who continues to be oppressed and excluded within a particular society and with respect to particular policies. The question of what are the consequences, I think, are far more helpful to us. What are the consequences of our practices and the policies that we uphold and the ways we educate children and educate students? What are the consequences of it? Because through the consequences, then we have a different kind of dialogue, right? Than to simply to cut it down and make one essentialist argument and say this is it. Because generally, what happens is that we forget the complexity of our humanity, and in the complexity of humanity means that there are multi-dimensional forces that we are engaging with, and people in. There's also the politics of geography. Right? So where we grow up, you know, what the histories of our particular areas are tied to our biographies. Our biographies didn't just happen as an individual phenomenon which we would be made to think. Our biographies are tied to the larger political economy, to the larger historical realities, and the very historical necessities of which we have been a part of. And that cannot be separated from how we have come to be who we are in this moment in time.
I think you made a very, very important point about how we internalize coloniality of power and we are socialized into it. And that reminded me of Bell Hooks and Nobunaga Thiongo's about decolonizing our own minds. And I think that's very relevant even in the context of higher education that you raised a moment ago.
Absolutely.
And as educators and practitioners, we need to first also look at ourselves and how we can decolonize ourselves even before starting to talk about the institutionalized practices.
And recognizing that whatever our own particular positionality is, to one extent or another, that's how we come to the table. We come to the table from that positionality. So we have to understand how the interiority of our being is linked to the exteriority that we live and engage with daily. Yeah.
So this may come out as a question or a comment. I'm not 100% sure. So on one hand, I want to say, thank you. I think everything that you're saying is brilliant, and it's when you're working from this Freirean perspective, it's highly valuable to hear the way you've articulated some of these ideas. Specifically, if I think of it from my own perspective, I work from critical literacy, in the field of critical literacy.
Yes.
So this is the kind of stuff that I'm really interested in hearing. However, I remember, initially I worked in South Africa, and so the question of decolonization started to infiltrate all kinds of spaces. And so the higher education in South Africa at the moment is in crisis because these questions are now bubbling up and it's becoming very riotous at some points. And so in order to try and kind of engage with this, I started reading around decolonization. It's not necessarily my field. And so I came across this critique about how critical pedagogy is part of a system that allows those of us in like social justice education to what they call make moves toward innocence. You know, so in other words, we see ourselves as social justice warriors. We see ourselves as trying to develop and practice a pedagogy of an emancipatory pedagogy. But to what extent are we actually perpetuating colonialism? How are we almost allowed to take up those positions? And so you'll talk about how some of these issues are also embodied. Kind of resonates with me because in reading some of these articles, I mean, so in South Africa, being a brown person, being a person of color, but not being African in the racial class, means that I always occupy this kind of space in the blurry edges, you know. So in South Africa, everything is black or white, and so being in the middle, I assume that being a person of color would mean that I'm part of the colonized. And so some of the articles on, some of the arguments on decolonization have started to name my own position as a brown settler colonialist. And so that implicates me in a whole different way. And so, you know, that kind of stopped, made my heart jump, because suddenly it put into crisis all the social justice work that I thought I was doing. And so I don't know if there's a response from a Freirean perspective or from your own that kind of helps to tease and helps us to think about some of these issues as well.
Right. I think that, again, when I listen to you, and part, I know the arguments, that there's a variety of arguments in relationship to the decolonizing question. Again, we have to come to the standpoint of what are the consequences. And what has been problematic around critical pedagogy at times has been the male-centered lens that predominated at a certain time. You know, there are those of us who have taken elements of critical pedagogy and we have reinscribed them in a different way by asking new questions and different questions that are much related to our own positionality and the absences that we experience as we try to engage questions of critical pedagogy. The other thing is it's important not to, and I will say this, I know this goes completely against the Western tradition of academia. I would caution us, all of us, to be very careful about marrying ourselves to any particular school of thought, but rather to have a kind of openness in how we engage those schools of thought in ways that allow us to think, what is the resonance of this to my own lived experience? And that also invites people to write from the power of their knowledge. And the power of their knowledge is linked to their own life experience, which is another element that is generally negated in terms of the Western Academy. So I think that those are some of the ways in which we attempt, right, to negotiate and navigate the minefields that are always at place. None of us should ever be so comfortable that we think that we've got it all, that somehow, you know, I've got it, so come along, I'm going to lead everybody. I think it's actually, and my experience of Freire was that one of the hardest things for us is to move beyond paternalism and essentializing our arguments and a kind of determinism that actually does not play itself out in relationship to our humanity. It is more a contrived notion. It serves certain people to use the determinist argument, whether it's about poverty or it's about women or it's, you know, so we're being challenged in many ways to let go of, you know, of those, we're fettered, our minds are fettered, and to let go of those fetters, to release and begin to let the air of our humanity, you know, the heart, the mind, the body, and spirit of our humanity to infuse our cognitive engagements. So it's no longer just a matter of what, the cognitive element, but all of our humanity coming into our scholarship. It's a very different way of doing our work. It also leads us to a different conversation about what is accountable and what's not. I mean, it's a whole, it shifts, it completely shifts the ground, which of course makes people who feel very comfortable with the Western tradition very uncomfortable, because there has been clear power, tied to that positionality. There's so much more that we could go, and if this is an area that I'm very much working and interested. So, and this is not just for you, but if there are ever issues that would take a lot more unpacking, I always welcome people writing to me. I mean, and then we just start a conversation either by email. Sometimes we end up having it by Skype. And we keep the conversation going. I think politically, in terms of the work that we're doing for those of us who have committed our lives, this is part of our responsibility, is to keep talking with one another, to keep engaging, and our willingness to bring our time and attention to other brothers and sisters who are trying to do this work. Okay, the last one, and then I maybe we take a little break, and then I do the second half. What do you think? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
It's not a question, but it's like what do you call that? You said about not being comfortable in anything that we take up, because, for example, in critical pedagogy itself, because I'm Salma from Malaysia, and then I learned about critical pedagogy, and then I there are certain things in critical pedagogy that I don't agree, especially coming from an Islamic point of view, because, for example, if we think that critical pedagogy always says about colonialization, and also, but for me itself, critical pedagogy comes from the Eurocentric perspective itself. For example, it comes from Marx, and also it comes from, for example, Frankfurt School. So for me, there are certain things that I do appreciate it in critical pedagogy, but also when it comes to me, and for example, if I were to implement critical pedagogy in my area, context, I would say that, what do you call that, there are certain things that probably will not be applicable, given that in my perspective, we have completely different worldview as compared to the ones that in critical pedagogy. Right. But in saying that, there are also good things also in critical pedagogy, because it is critical pedagogy that make me think that what is it in my culture, or what is it in my religious understanding that actually also what you can also encourage the way of the way critical pedagogy has as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I would love to, if I had the opportunity to unpack a number of the things that you've said, but what you do remind me of constantly is the manner in which the most human thing for us to do is to reinvent ideas, and the process of reinvention, or the process of making them our own, is absolutely important in the process of empowerment. In fact, historically, the people who could make ideas their own were those who had power. And so for those of us coming from, subaltern positions, part of our own struggle is first really engaging questions of culture and power, and how they work, and how historically they've been implicated in our own lives, right, in our own histories, and then begin to think what elements are useful to us, and what elements are problematic in relationship to our own positionality. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a quick break. How long? Thank you. We were just talking, neither Louise nor I tweet. We're not tweeters. And everybody says, you have to tweet. And we were saying, oh, damn, it's like one more thing to do, to worry about a tweet account, But anyway, that doesn't mean that I don't recognize the value, and that some people really are doing some wonderful things, tweeting out in the world. Anyway, all right, so we're going to focus on this last section is really trying to what I've been trying to do is kind of tease out Freirean values for decolonizing praxis. So I'll just get started. The ideas of Brazilian educational philosopher and early epistemologist of the South, Paulo Freire, offer some key values in the quest for decolonizing praxis. For Freire, the purpose of education should be tied to the practice of human freedom and the process of becoming more empowered subjects of history. From his view, culture and language constituted inseparable aspects of our humanity, through which the ontological, the epistemological, and cosmological dimensions of our existence are expressed. Whether linked to knowledge production through the arts or literacy, our yearning for freedom had to emerge from the cultural experience of the individual as a communal being. As such, the cultural relationship of the individual to communal life remained paramount to education. Freire opposed then what he called a banking or rote form of education, instead of calling for a pedagogy and way of life that supported the evolution of individual and collective consciousness through the affirmation of all forms of life. Banking education does absolutely the opposite. Freire's creative and engaged view, his underlying dialogical approach, and his persistence in connecting questions of inequality to schooling and society led many around the world, including Jerry and Colin Kirkwood here in Scotland, to embrace Freire's transformative ethos of education. And now more and more, as a consequence of their work, have begun to look at Freire's work. But I also want to say that there's an interesting phenomenon that is just happening, is that in different parts of the world, they're beginning to retake up Freire's ideas. And there had been like this hiatus as the right began to push through and begin to reinforce a culture of silence with respect to any ideas that talked about liberation or emancipatory education. Grounded then in the decolonizing notion, praxis for Freire emerges from understanding that education either functions as an instrument which is utilized to facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes a practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. The process is also grounded in a dialectical or relational understanding of objectivity and subjectivity, past and present, individual and community, in ways that defy privileging either or binaries or linear modes of thinking. Similarly, the debilitating impact of inequalities upon subaltern communities challenges us to unveil the hidden and not so hidden ideological values of privilege that inform the development and use of instrumentalizing curriculum, materials, textbooks, assessment tools, promotion criteria, manufactured aspirations, and institutional relationships. Moreover, hidden allegiance or complicity with privilege can render educators blind to or obstinate in the face of humanizing alternatives. The task at hand then is to unveil and deconstruct, instrumentalize arrangements of accountability while creating and enhancing opportunities to learn in the interests of self-determination, culturally democratic life, and a participatory civil society. Furthermore, decolonizing our minds from caste, class, racialized, patriarchal, and heterosexist conditioning and codes of conduct has been one of the most difficult issues that decolonizing educators confront when trying to create alliances across social and cultural divides. But what is clear for those of us who have remained in this complex and enduring and tractable struggle is this: if there is to be a genuinely decolonizing praxis of pedagogy, research, or educational leadership, it must be politically grounded on emancipatory principles linked to what Enrique Dussel termed an ethics of liberation, whose tenets uphold a holistic reading of the world, challenge the logic of capital, espouse subaltern empowerment, and embrace a commitment to laboring with the most disenfranchised. Keeping all this in mind, I want to turn to Freirean principles for decolonizing educational praxis. So the first one is that decolonizing praxis has to be pedagogical. To define research or leadership as critically pedagogical moves us away from hierarchical and individualistic banking models of practice. Instead, such a perspective guides us towards an embodied theories and practices that engage education as a social phenomenon that evolves pedagogically through communal structures of participation. The vision here is to teach, learn, construct knowledge, and lead together as a way of life as we move to transform the world as community. We do this through a humanizing praxis of inquiry and decision-making, which also informs the dialogical practices that underlie this approach. About this, Freire argued, for apart from inquiry, apart from praxis, individuals cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through restless and patient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. And essentially his point there is that the most human thing is to ask, to question about what is happening around us. Decolonizing praxis requires then a moral commitment. In Pedagogy of Freedom, Freire wrote, "Human existence is, in fact, a radical and profound tension between good and evil, between dignity and indignity, between decency and indecency, between the beauty and the ugliness of the world." And the reason he says that tension is that what he's referring to there is our capacity to remain within the dialectic, within the dialectical tension that tends to take opposites and create binaries, and instead remaining in the tension, which allows for greater space in terms of the field of engagement. Yet it has been the stubborn unwillingness to contend with institutional tensions and difficult moral questions within schools and the larger society that has resulted in oppressive bureaucratic system of education, research, and leadership ruled by absolute top-down and expedient policies. In the wake of such neglect, the tensions of injustice and their consequences are left unaddressed. Instead, a conserving bureaucratic culture of control, contradictions, distortions, denial, manipulation, and hostility permeates the enterprise of education, often tangibly experienced in ways that further alienate and isolate students, teachers, and administrators from their own labor and consigns them to institutional lives of banality and routinized existence. Another principle is this notion that decolonizing praxis has to be understood as a political act. Inherent to a decolonizing praxis for social justice is the idea that if, as Freire proposed, education is political, then too decolonizing praxis is a political act. As such, a decolonizing praxis for social justice must create the conditions to question why, to question the conditions in which we exist and how we came to be as we are, and how the conditions in which we live and navigate, how they came to be this way. And more importantly, how can we work together in the interest of democratic life? And of course, here Freire says no oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why. So at the moment that any group of people is questioning the why of their existence, and they are shut down or relegated to the culture of silence, we know that a process of oppression, that a politics of oppression is at work. Another concept is that decolonizing praxis is not a neutral affair. A decolonizing praxis for social justice is never a neutral affair. Desmond Tutu asserted during the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. As such, a critical vision of pedagogy, methodology, and leadership exposes the illusion of neutrality through examining this asymmetry of power relations in the face of exclusionary policies and practices within universities and societies. Sometimes my own accent comes out, and I'm like, oh, it's coming out. Decolonizing praxis as a dialectical process. So we come back to the question of the dialectic. To understand decolonizing praxis as a dialectical process is to recognize that dialectical tension between the needs of individuals and those of the community are always competing dimensions of our humanity. The tension here is embraced as human creative force that permits for individual participation in the evolution of a collective process of self-determination without degenerating into moral relativism, even in the midst of resistance. Our comfort with the dialectics of decolonizing praxis allows us to engage with our social agency, with the unfolding of social consciousness, and resistance as a meaningful and potentially humanizing moral compass. In fact, often we need to remind ourselves that on one hand, if we believe in democratic life, then we must accept that dissent is absolutely a part of democratic life. You can't have democracy without, the room and the space for dissent. Another element is critical praxis is dialogical. This points then to a regenerative praxis of reflection, of dialogue and action, and so on. In this sense, dialogue is not only essential, but also serves as a political means by which we forge relationships of empowerment and establish participatory communities for social change. The process of dialogue then entails a number of elements. One, that a political means, we have to think of it as a political means for empowerment and for establishing participatory community. That it is purposeful communication that leads to self-determination and political action. That it is a collective process of conscientization. That is communal labor that supports the development of solidarity. And it is an open and humanizing process of inquiry. For Freire, dialogue constitutes a way of knowing and being, rather than a tactic or a skill to be used to persuade others, or to seduce others, for that matter. Dialogue, then, must be understood not as mere individual exchange, but a collective process from whence we come to know and act upon our world in order to change it. Another element is the decolonizing praxis as conscientization, or what he calls conscientização, for those that know his language. The Freirean principles of conscientization defines here the ongoing aim and practice of decolonizing praxis for social justice. This asks us to remain ever vigilant in our labor as cultural workers, as we seek to practice and to be vigilant of our own personal consciousness, the consciousness of our own conditions and the social location that we hold. The social consciousness of structural conditions, to understand how these two intersect, to have an awareness of power relations that inform cultural, political, social, and economic conditions, and to embrace individual and social responsibility as cultural citizens and subjects of our own lives and destinies. Another element that I'd like to raise is the notion of decolonizing praxis as critical democratic negotiation. However, none of the above then is possible without an ongoing process of critical democratic negotiation. So if we're going to talk about having places of dissent or to engage with different views and wanting to have dialogue instead of debate, then we have to find the ways in which we enter into processes of negotiation, and which within process of negotiation, what really we're talking about is where do we find our commonalities that help us to work despite the differences that we're struggling with. And maybe in the process of working across our commonalities, we begin to understand each other's differences and the value that they have in relationship to our own lives. This points to engaging the dialectical tension between authority and freedom, organically within the actual context and relationship in which tensions and struggles arise. The dialectical tension between authority and freedom is a significant and necessary aspect of our human condition, which cannot be avoided without sacrificing democracy. About this, Freire posited it is not possible to have authority without freedom, or vice versa. And what he means, the way I understand Freire in relationship to authority, is that there's always an element of authority. For example, in the classroom, teachers might say, "Oh, well, I give the power to my students." We all. That's, it sounds nice, but it's not true, because as an educator, you have responsibility. You make decisions about students' marks. right? Which puts you in a position of power. You evaluate them. You make decisions when you write letters of recommendation or you don't write letters of recommendation. So in fact, you have a certain authority. And so the question is, do you use that authority in the interest of political emancipation and liberation, or do you use that authority as a gatekeeper to perpetuate the status quo? These are the questions that arise for me around this. Another area is the notion that we have to understand that cultural context is absolutely essential to our work as educators, whether it be in classrooms or out in the community or out in different organizations. We have to understand the context, the historical context, the cultural context. For Freire, the cultural context constitutes an essential dimension of decolonizing praxis. This is significant given the dominant worldview that marginalizes other ways of being and knowing. Of this, Freire wrote, "One cannot expect positive results from an educational or political action program which fails to respect the particular view of the people held, or the particular view held by the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion, good intentions notwithstanding." And that last piece is important because sometimes people, when we're trying to deal with some of the ways in which teachers are perpetuating hegemonic practices in their classrooms, for example, they become completely defensive, like immediately, and what I notice is the first thing is kind of, well, I'm a good person. I have good, and we want to say, look, let's start that as our base. I'm going to start as a base, as long as you haven't shown me anything else, I'm going to remain on that base that you're a good human being and that you're here because you care about these issues and you want to, find ways in which to be more effective in your own practice, particularly around emancipatory practice. So what it means then, we have to build the capacity and openness to hear critique, to engage in ways that help us to think more deeply. And that requires then a great deal of humility, a sense of respect, of true respect for one another, and a capacity and a willingness to listen and believe and have faith that others have something to say to us that may transform us, that may help us to understand the world better. Another element is the notion of the integration of human faculties. Another significant aspect then here is this decolonizing praxis, is this commitment to a relationship of solidarity with nature, and that sense that our nature, our human nature, brings about a whole set of faculties, important faculties, and I particularly look at the evolution of social agency and collective agency when we come communally as a form of kind of political grace, is the term I use, political grace, because there's a force that we create when we come together and we work together. The power, what empowers the collective process is how our energy and our passion comes together. And this has so much to do with our willingness to bring all of ourselves to the table and to understand ourselves more than just, a cognitive head speaking, but in fact, mind, body, heart, and spirit at work. Moreover, given its emancipatory purpose, a decolonizing praxis requires in the integral process where mind, heart, and body come together in the service of liberation. The integral dynamic generates the conditions for individual and collective empowerment and generates the creative force through our communal exchanges that mobilizes us towards emancipatory possibilities and social transformation. Decolonizing praxis rebels against the fragmenting and fracturing of our humanity and instead aims to prepare us to engage with love as a political force, which can connect us to the truth of our material conditions that surround us, alert us to the possibilities, and propel us more openly towards relationships of solidarity and social justice. The question of ethics was always a central question in relationship to Freire's work, and those who know his work know that he would always come back to this question of ethics. So for Freire, the question of ethics was always on the forefront for his thinking of education, politics, and social transformation. The point is crystallized in Pedagogy of Freedom, where he takes up the ethical dilemmas and concerns at the heart of a pedagogy of liberation. 4 significant needs that further inform a decolonizing praxis for social justice that include the need to counter determinism, the need to assume responsibility for our lives as individuals and communal beings, the need to carry out our practices through fellowship and solidarity, and the need to understand and embrace our unfinishedness, that we as human beings are always unfinished, that our knowledge is always partial. And because of that, rather than seeing that as a negative, that we celebrate that because it's what always reminds us why we need one another. Decolonizing praxis as unfinished then becomes the next piece here. So he wrote, if this world were created finished, if it were a finished world, it would no longer be susceptible to transformation. The unfinishedness is essential to our human condition. Whenever there is life, there is unfinishedness. So we see the kind of the moving and mobilizing of life when it is unfettered. And we see that in relationships as well. You know, one of the saddest things is we don't understand that all of these elements that I'm talking about impact our relationships on very personal levels. And sometimes, for example, I see people who are in love relationships, and when they start off, they're so happy, you know, there's a kind of movement and there is a lot of energy and all of this, and then when they're together for a little while, they start kind of imposing on each other, and they begin to close down. So it even happens in deep, intimate relations where we close down because we begin to project onto the person who we want them to be, rather than our capacity to accept who the person is. At the heart then of this idea is the recognition that oppression is never a permanent condition, and it is precisely because no human condition is ever absolute or finished that the struggle remains viable and hope fertile, even within political movements that may appear at times desolate and barren. So I'm kind of going to move to this last conclusion here, and I'm going to go to Erich Fromm, which, because of Freire's love for Erich Fromm and his embracing of Fromm's notion of the art of loving, I think is where Freire began to really bring the notion of love to his work. But here Fromm says, it is on the assumption that humans are sheep. Of course, that used to say men, but I took the liberty of saying humans. That the great inquisitors and the dictators have built their systems. More than that, this very belief that humans are sheep and hence need leaders to make decisions for them has often given educators, researchers, and leaders the sincere conviction that they were fulfilling a moral duty, even though a tragic one. In contrast, a decolonizing praxis of social justice and community empowerment encompasses a deep commitment in theory and practice to struggle with the subaltern rather than for them. So it's not about going into communities and helping them. That whole helping, you know, that's where I think Christianity got it completely wrong, and it continues to perpetuate that notion of helping rather than saying, I am with you because you are my other me. When I see you, you are my other me. There's an indigenous saying, "Tú eres mi otro yo," you know, in Lakesh, right? So you are my other me. So imagine from the standpoint of an ethics that if we come to the table and we come to our work with others, always remembering you are my other me. When I see you, I see the other me. And it has a different way of bringing us together with far more compassion and dignity than seeing each other as competitors or seeing each other as, you know, that we're warring one another. In concert with this commitment, then Freire argues, the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality, so that knowing it better, he or she can transform it. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into dialogue with them. This person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor of history or of all people or the liberator of the oppressed, but he or she does commit himself or herself within history to fight at their side. At the heart of a decolonizing praxis of pedagogy, methodology, and leadership, then, there must exist a significant epistemological transformation which must move us to an affirming revolutionary sensibility in how we know and make sense of our world. May our lives and our labor for social justice in schools and society be infused daily with Freire's abiding commitment to dialogue and dedication to an armed love, a radical love that denounces injustice and bigotry, while it empowers us to remain ever steady and open to cultural differences, human differences that speak to the legacies of our diverse survival on the planet, a diverse survival that is completely linked to the reality of our historical conditions in which we've had to survive. Thank you.
I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on any simple exercise you could suggest to me that will help me become aware of my inherent biases.
I like the cheating. Okay, so that particular question is informed by the belief that someone could figure that out, Alex, for you. I would hope, you know, I mean, just we're teasing. I would hope that a whole lot of what we've been talking about would be, would resonate with responding to your question. I mean, issues of the notion of self-vigilance, of political commitment, a sense of asking ourselves, what are the consequences of my believing in this way? What are the consequences of my behaving in this way? You know, who wins and who loses in the process of my attitude and my actions and my words and my behavior out in the world. I mean, those to me are really important questions, and I think of that. So, for example, I talked about how last night was really difficult, and part of if I'm really honest with you, there was a part of me that just wanted to go, fuck. I'm just honest. I'm sorry if it offends you, but this is like I am so damn tired that the last thing I want to do is continue with this, right? But it wasn't about me. It was about us and what was trying to happen, even if it didn't happen how I would have liked it to happen. But what happened, I have to believe, is what had to happen given the conditions and the realities of the people who were in the room, the conditions under which we were trying to work. And I have to just, trust, in essence, that people were doing the best they could at that moment. And so when I work from that standpoint with myself and with others, it helps me, it opens a space for me to also be more self-vigilant and be able to say, oh, you know what, I have to not do that. So I learned over time in that situation, to say, put this aside for now and let me stay in the discomfort of it. Let me be with the discomfort of it. But there was a time when I wouldn't have been able to do that. I have to be honest with you. There was a time when that would have been very, very difficult for me. And so the process of engaging and thinking through, what are the consequences if I behave this way, if I say this, if I do that? And not in a way to silence myself, but in a way to enter into a criticality that is truly humanizing and that remembers that I am not the center of the universe. That the center of the universe is, in fact, we are one. We are the center of the universe as a collectivity, we're not one drop of the ocean. In other words, what I mean is I am only a drop in the ocean. We are each a drop in the ocean. And the more potent, I always think about that. I don't know if you have it here, but in the US they would have this thing you drop into the toilet and it would turn blue. So I think, okay, let us be like potent drops in the sea of humanity, in the ocean of humanity. I mean, potent drops for liberation, where we come to the table, there is no question of what our ethical commitment is, and there is no question that underlying everything we do, whether we're a scholar, whether we're a nurse, whether we're an artist, whether we're cleaning, the janitor cleaning, the building, whether we're the bus driver, whether we're the dancer, that everything, that what we do is inspired through enormous love for ourselves, each other, and the world. Thank you.